He barked once, just once, and they stopped the execution. Not because of protocol, not because of mercy, but because the dog knew. They were seconds away from taking an innocent man's life when the silence shattered because the German Shepherd refused to be quiet. This is not just a story about a man on death row. This is about the one soul who never forgot, who never gave up, who buried the truth beneath dirt and memory, and clawed it back when the world had already closed the casket. Who is this dog? Why did his growl terrify a room full of armed men? And what secret was he holding all these years? You're about to uncover a story built on betrayal, buried evidence, and a bond stronger than any order ever given. A war dog, retired and half forgotten, carries the final piece of a puzzle that could unravel a conspiracy woven through the military, the courts, and the silence of those long gone. But here's the question. Did he survive for justice, or was he trained to keep it hidden all along? You tell me. Hit like if this caught you off guard. Subscribe if you want to follow the entire truth, from first bark to final breath. And comment below, what do you think the dog saw that no one else did? The execution chamber at Grafton State Penitentiary was always cold, but this morning it felt colder. Maybe it was the fog outside clinging to the frosted windows. Or maybe it was the way the air seemed to stop moving when David Hawk Heldon entered the room. Clad in a faded orange jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed lightly in front of him, the 46-year-old war veteran walked with the posture of a man used to carrying more weight than most. He wasn't scared. He looked ready, not for death, but for something else. Final requests are a formality, Mr. Halden, said Warden Dorsey, a man with a voice like gravel and eyes that didn't blink often. He sat across from David in the sterile briefing room. 2 guards stood by the door, hands resting near their holsters. Most ask for a cigarette, a steak, some say a prayer, so let's get this over with. David looked up. His eyes weren't pleading, they were calm, heavy, the kind of heavy only men who'd seen too much could carry. I want to see my dog, he said. Dorsey blinked once. Excuse me? K9. My partner, Shadow. David leaned forward, voice steady. We served 3 tours together. He's retired now. I found out he was adopted by a family in Harrisburg. I just want 1 hour with him. That's it. No steak, no prayer. Just that. The silence in the room stretched as if even the walls needed time to process the absurdity of the request. You're asking me, the warden said slowly, to let a dog into a maximum security penitentiary on execution day? David nodded. Yes, sir. You're either losing your mind, or this is some kind of stunt. You stunt? David's voice softened. I need to see him one more time. Dorsey stood, brushing non-existent lint from his coat. You have 36 hours left to live, Halden. Don't waste them chasing ghosts. But just as he turned to leave, something in him faltered. A flicker of something unreadable passed over the warden's face. He turned back, eyes narrowing. What did you say the dog's name was? Shadow. Another pause. The warden sat back down. His fingers tapped the table. Once, twice, then stopped. Here's something you don't know, he muttered. I've seen that dog. A year ago, he was brought in for a prison drug sweep. The damn animal froze in front of your cell and wouldn't move for 5 minutes. The guards couldn't get him to budge. It took his handler dragging him away. David's breath caught, just slightly. He remembered me. Dorsey didn't respond. He simply stared at the wall, jaw clenched tight. Then, with a sigh that sounded like it came from his soul, he reached for the phone. I'll make a call. You've got until midnight tomorrow. That's all I can give you. Thank you, David said quietly, voice raw. As the guards escorted him out, David allowed himself a rare smile. He hadn't smiled in years, not since the trial, not since the lies buried his name under a mountain of false evidence. Not since he'd watched Shadow be led away in chains, his ears pinned back, confused and whimpering. Back in his cell, David stared up at the cracked ceiling. He didn't have a plan, not really. All he had was a hunch, and a dog with a memory sharper than any man he'd ever served with. That night, Warden Dorsey opened a locked drawer in his office and pulled out a dusty folder labeled Operation Emberfall Confidential. Inside, old photos, a classified mission brief, and a small Polaroid of a soldier in desert camo kneeling next to a large black German shepherd, tongue lolling, ears. Dorsey's hand hovered over the photo before he slid it into his coat pocket. If Shadow was coming, things were about to get complicated. The visitation room was stark and fluorescent, with a metal table bolted to the floor and a single surveillance camera in the corner humming faintly. David sat alone, shackled only at the ankles, his wrists free just this once. He'd showered and shaved at the warden's quiet request. "The dog deserves to see the man he remembers," Dorsey had muttered, handing him a worn-out comb. Now the room was still except for the soft creak of David's fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Then, the door hissed open. Shadow entered, led by a young handler who looked half David's age. The German shepherd was larger than memory, his coat darker, thicker, flecked with the gray of time. His gait was slow but sure, powerful, even graceful in its restraint. The handler unclipped the leash and took a step back. David leaned forward slightly, his voice catching in his throat. "Shadow," he said, barely above a whisper. The dog looked at him. No tail wagged, no soft whine, just a blank, calculating stare. Shadow's ears twitched once, then fell still. He scanned the room the way a soldier clears a space. "It's me, boy," David said again, more firmly. "It's Hawk." Still nothing. No recognition. No flicker of memory in those amber eyes. Shadow took a slow step to the side, his nose twitching, and sat. A silence heavier than any courtroom verdict settled between them. David glanced at the handler. The young man only shrugged. "He's distant with strangers," he offered. "Maybe give him a second." Stranger. The word struck David like a bullet. He had slept next to this dog in blown-out bunkers, watched him rip through enemy lines, held him trembling after that IED blast in Kandahar. Stranger? No. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was something else. David reached into his shirt pocket and slowly pulled out a small, frayed scrap of cloth, a corner from the red-stitched American flag that once adorned Shadow's original vest. He laid it gently on the table. Shadow turned his head, slowly. His nose lifted. He sniffed the air once, then again. His eyes narrowed. David held his breath as he extended his hand. The dog stood. One step, two. David's heart pounded. "That's it, buddy," he whispered. "Come on, remember." Shadow reached the edge of the table. His nose hovered just above David's hand. Then, in a movement too fast to see, he ducked beneath the outstretched palm and stepped to David's side. Close but not touching, his breath came quick, uneven. David hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand to the base of Shadow's neck, fingers brushing against the familiar groove beneath his fur, where the collar used to sit. That was when it happened. A deep, primal growl erupted from Shadow's throat. Not angry, not fearful, but guttural. Ancient, like something buried had clawed its way to the surface. The handler jolted upright, alarmed. "Shadow," he called, reaching for the leash. But David raised a hand, not to the dog but to the air, as if warding off ghosts. "Don't," he said, eyes locked on the shepherd. "He's not attacking." Shadow's growl deepened, but his stance never shifted to aggression. Instead, his legs stiffened, his muscles locked, and his ears pinned back, not out of threat, but hyper-focus. His nose darted toward David's chest, just over the ribs. Then, he whimpered. A small, sharp sound, brief and raw. David froze. He knew that sound. It was the same sound Shadow had made the night the ambush hit them outside Helmand. After David took shrapnel to the side and bled out behind a pile of rubble while Shadow stood guard, refusing to leave. The medics said Shadow saved his life that night. Now Shadow pressed his nose to David's side again, Then, he sat back and stared, unmoving. David looked down at his jumpsuit. It was clean, sterilized, but beneath it, near his ribs, was the scar. Scar tissue from that old wound where a piece of metal had entered and never come out. The same shrapnel that the surgeons feared was too dangerous to remove completely. "You is it, boy?" David murmured. Shadow didn't move, but he growled again, low, continuous, focused. "Is it the scent?" the handler asked, now visibly rattled. David didn't answer. His mind was racing. He hadn't thought of that injury in years, but something in the dog's behavior, his complete dismissal at first, then his shift at the moment of contact. It didn't feel like instinct. It felt like recognition. Shadow hadn't forgotten. He had been. Then came the next detail. David noticed Shadow's left ear twitch once, then again, back, forth, a loop. It was a code, a tick, a signal David had trained into him for battlefield reconnaissance. The meaning was simple. Target known, trust uncertain. David sat back, stunned. Shadow remembered everything, but he didn't trust him. That meant something was wrong. Desperately wrong. David's mind flashed back to the trial. The murder he was accused of. The officer found dead in a motel room. David's fingerprints on the weapon. A blood trail matching his boots. But there was no motive, no direct link, only circumstantial evidence stacked to bury him. He'd always known it was planted, engineered, but he had no proof until now, maybe. The dog had picked something up, something beneath the surface, a scent, a memory, something hidden. David's breath grew shallow. "Warden needs to cut this short," the handler said suddenly. "He didn't want us here long, just an hour." David didn't respond. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table again. Shadow sat beside him now, not touching but close, watching him, breathing in sync, like they had on watch all those nights ago. The growl had stopped, but not the tension. Shadow's eyes never left David's side. David whispered, barely audible, "What did they hide in me, boy?" Shadow blinked once, then stood, and growled again. Night inside Grafton felt like its own kind of prison, thicker than the concrete walls, heavier than the chains. Most inmates used the time to sleep off the weight of their days, or to lie in the dark counting regrets. But David didn't sleep. Not tonight. Not with Shadow in the adjacent cell, lying silent on the cold floor just feet away. The guards had made an exception. An unspoken truce. Shadow could stay one night in the observation unit near David's cell, separated by a clear partition, no restraints, no handlers. It was supposed to be a mercy. Instead, it was a memory uncoiling in the dark. David sat upright on his cot, his back to the wall, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the motionless silhouette of the dog. Shadow lay curled at first, but sometime after midnight he stirred. Slowly, his body stiffened, ears twitched once, then again. David didn't move. In the dim light from the hallway, Shadow rose without sound. His shoulders squared, his head lifted. Then, it began. The growl started low, barely audible, but David heard it clear as day. He knew it. Not the same as earlier. This wasn't a warning growl. This was defensive, calculated, battle-ready. A memory had surfaced, and it was crawling through the dog's bloodstream like adrenaline. His body lowered into a stance so precise it froze time. Then he paused. Not toward David, not toward the glass, but into the empty air of his own cell, slamming into the corner with terrifying velocity. Claws scraping concrete, teeth bared at a threat only he could see. The guard at the far end of the block jumped, hand going to his holster. "Hey, what the hell's wrong with the dog?" Another officer moved fast toward the control box. "Do we sedate him?" David's voice rang out like a gunshot. "No." Both guards paused. David didn't raise his voice, didn't plead. He simply stood up and placed one hand on the glass, his eyes locked on the dog. Shadow spun, hackles raised, panting like he'd just run through gunfire. He backed toward the far wall of the cell, eyes wide, every muscle coiled like a spring. David didn't blink. He whispered into the silence, 9 Romeo 4, Code Frost. The change was immediate. Shadow's breathing hitched, his body froze mid-step. The code wasn't just random. The dog stopped growling, his ears perked slightly, head tilting. David stepped closer to the glass, voice low. Stand down. You're home, soldier. Shadow blinked. His entire posture shifted, like the memory had unclenched its jaws around him. He sat slowly, chest heaving, and tilted his head again. Then came something neither of the guards had seen all night. The dog whined. Not from fear, from recognition. David nodded once. Yeah, you remember. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with things long buried. Blood, dust, smoke, a wall that collapsed too fast, a man screaming into comms for air support, a dog leaping through fire to drag an injured body back by the vest, the flashbang that tore their senses apart. The scars on David's ribs burned. He'd never told the prison medics why that area still ached during storms. They thought it was old trauma. It was, but not physical. Shadow rose again, this time not in defense. He walked toward the glass, slow, steady. Then he did something that stole the air from David's lungs. He lifted a paw, placed it against the partition. David didn't hesitate. He pressed his palm to the same spot from the other side. There was no sound, no command, but everything that mattered passed between them in that second. Behind David, the younger guard cleared his throat. That was intense. The other one muttered, that dog looked like he was back in Fallujah. David didn't look away from Shadow. Not Fallujah, he said quietly. Kunar Province, Ridgepoint 4, Night Watch. Same growl, same reaction. You sure? One guard asked. David finally turned, his face unreadable. I was there. He sat back down on the cot, the adrenaline settling in his bones like dust. Shadow returned to his corner, but now, he was lying facing David, not the wall. His breathing evened, his eyes stayed open. The memory had resurfaced, and the dog had navigated it. David leaned back against the wall and stared up at the ceiling. He remembers more than they think, he whispered to himself. His mind was already running ahead. If Shadow's reaction was triggered by memory, then that whatever he smelled earlier, had to be connected to something deeper, not just the wound. Maybe something tied to the night of the crime. But there was more. In the final seconds before the dog attacked the wall, David had seen his eyes, which meant one terrifying possibility. Shadow hadn't been reacting to the past. He might have been tracking a presence that still lingered. David didn't sleep the rest of that night. And neither did the dog. The morning inside Grafton was a study in gray. Gray light filtered through the high, narrow window in David's cell, casting a muted sheen across the floor. He hadn't slept, but his body no longer felt tired, just alert. Shadow had remained still most of the night, but as the light shifted, something inside him began to stir. David noticed it in the dog's breathing first. Deeper, slower, like a machine powering down to reset itself. Then Shadow stood and approached the glass again. David did the same, drawn by something unspoken. The guards had relaxed by then, used to the quiet tension between them. One had gone for coffee, the other scrolled through his phone behind the glass. David stepped closer, crouched, pressing his back against the wall beside the partition. Shadow mimicked the motion from the other side, moving in slow, deliberate steps. The way he moved now wasn't just calm. Without warning, Shadow's head lowered. Then, in one precise movement, he lifted his paw and tapped the glass once, then again, 3 taps, then he sat back. David's eyes narrowed. 3 taps, he murmured, remembering. That was recon code, visual confirmation pending. Something had locked in Shadow's mind. A smell, a shape. A second later, the guard buzzed open the door. Warden says you get 5 minutes together, without the glass. He sounded almost curious now, like he too had begun to suspect this was more than a goodbye. They brought Shadow into David's cell, under armed supervision, but no muzzle this time. The room fell quiet as Shadow walked to David, sniffed him once from the boots up, and then did something unexpected. He nuzzled against David's chest, right where the old wound was. David froze. Then, just as gently, the dog extended his tongue and gave one slow, deliberate lick across the scar beneath David's collarbone. David's breath caught. It wasn't affection, it was identification. A way of triggering recall. Shadow stepped back, stared at him with an expression that almost looked like expectation. Then he lifted his paw again and pressed it gently to David's chest. His claws extended slightly, and with meticulous precision, he dragged 2 short lines downward, and then a diagonal slash crossing them. David blinked. The pattern was unmistakable. A triangle, crossed by 2 vertical lines. A symbol from deep in his memory. "No," he whispered. "You remember that, how?" The older guard watching from the doorway frowned. "What is that?" David didn't answer right away. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. That mark had haunted him for years, carved into a tree near their forward base in the Kunar province. It wasn't standard, it wasn't even American. It was the unofficial mark of Task Unit Emberfall, a covert unit never acknowledged in any official document, not even in David's trial, because it didn't exist on paper. "You saw it the day we buried the intel drop, didn't you?" David asked the dog. Shadow gave a low grunt, like a response. "You were there." The moment clicked. It wasn't the wound Shadow was identifying. It was what lay beneath it. A memory. David pressed both hands against his chest. "I thought I was losing it," he murmured, "but you just confirmed it." The guards exchanged glances. One stepped in. "Hey, you good?" David looked up, eyes wild but lucid. "There's a steel box," he said aloud, louder than necessary. "We buried it after the firefight on the ridge, under the old camper tree, right by Checkpoint Delta." The guards stared. What the hell are you talking about?" the younger one asked. David stood up. "It was an off-the-book drop. Field intel we weren't supposed to collect. But we did. Me, Shadow, and Corporal Wynn. We buried it under that tree because Command told us the site was compromised. Said to forget it happened." The room was still. David paced now, the words flowing like they had been damned for years. "There were files in that box, a map, communications intercepted between 2 officers. One was US, the other wasn't." "Sir, you're talking crazy," the older guard interrupted, more uncomfortable than accusatory. David pointed to the symbol Shadow had just scratched onto his chest. "That's the Emberfall insignia. That's what the box was marked with." The air turned heavy. David continued, "If that box still exists, it proves I wasn't at that motel alone. It proves someone else was pulling the strings." Shadow sat down, tail still, gaze locked on the door like he expected someone to burst through any second. The guards radioed for the warden. David walked back toward Shadow, knelt beside him, and ran a hand down his back. "You never forgot, did you?" he whispered, "even when they tried to make me forget." The warden entered 5 minutes later, suit slightly rumpled, face unreadable. "You said something about a box?" he asked. David stood, meeting his gaze. "Not just a box. Evidence. Buried under a tree outside of Kandahar. And a mark your people buried too." Warden Dorsey's jaw clenched. His silence stretched a little too long. "You knew something," David said. "Didn't you?" Instead of answering, Dorsey looked at Shadow, then at the scratch on David's chest. His eyes darkened. "Get me satellite access to the Delta Echo Ridge sector," the warden ordered one of the guards. "Now." David turned to Shadow. The dog didn't move. He was still listening, still waiting. And David knew, somewhere in the dirt under that tree, the past was waiting too. The warden had been gone less than an hour when the note appeared, slid under David's cell door with silent precision. No footsteps, no keys jangling in the corridor. Just a single sheet of paper folded 3 times, with the kind of handwriting that looked too clean to belong to any inmate. David unfolded it slowly, Shadow sitting beside him like a statue. One sentence stared back at him. "If the box is real, I can get you there, midnight. Cell block E. Bring the dog, no name, no instructions. Just the unmistakable sense that someone else inside this concrete tomb had been listening, watching." At 11:45 p.m., the overhead lights dimmed, flickered once, and then cut out completely. A routine systems check the guards claimed over the intercom, but David knew better. He heard the quiet click of the service latch behind the wall vent unlocking. Then came a voice, calm, low, female. The panel swung open, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough to crawl through. David didn't hesitate, neither did Shadow. Together they disappeared into the ventilation shaft, as if following the ghosts of their own past. The woman waiting on the other side wasn't dressed like a guard anymore. She'd changed into tactical gear, black sleeves rolled to the elbows, a sidearm clipped to her hip, hair tucked under a ball cap. "Name's Elira," she said without turning. "I used to work with the unit you're talking about. Emberfall wasn't supposed to exist, but I know it did." David studied her posture, the quiet force behind her movements, the old burn mark on her right wrist. They exited through a back gate normally reserved for waste disposal. No alarms sounded. No guards chased. Someone had paved the way. A black SUV waited in the shadows, engine running. Shadow leapt into the back without needing a command. David followed, pulse steady but rising. As they pulled away from the prison, the lights of Grafton faded behind them like the last flickers of a dream you'd rather forget. By dawn, they had crossed into restricted territory outside the old forward operating base near Ridgepoint 4, now technically abandoned. Elira drove without speaking, her eyes scanning every ridge, every break in the tree line. "We're not alone out here," she said. "We never are." The truck stopped at the edge of a forest that looked more like a memory than a place. David stepped out first, breathing in the scent of pine needles soaked in morning fog. Shadow exited next, but he didn't bark, didn't growl. He stood still, ears forward, as if something in the soil was calling to him. They walked half a mile in silence before David stopped at the base of a massive camphor tree. It still bore the jagged scar he remembered, 3 clawed lines carved by a bayonet long rusted into the dirt. "This is it," he said. "We buried it right here. Me, Shadow, and Corporal Nen." David dropped to one knee and began to dig with his hands, the dirt cold and packed hard. Elira joined him without a word, pulling out a small entrenching tool from her pack. Shadow circled them, nose twitching, body tense. Then came the sound. A whisper at first, but unmistakable to anyone who's ever worn a uniform in the dark. Metal sliding against metal. A rifle bolt. Elira heard it too. Her head snapped up. "Sniper! North slope! Move!" The first shot cracked through the air a second later, splintering bark inches above David's shoulder. He threw himself sideways as Shadow lunged forward, pushing David flat against the ground. Elira returned fire in the general direction of the ridge while dragging David behind the tree's wide trunk. "They knew," she hissed. "They knew you'd come." "Now?" David shouted over the next round of gunfire. "It's been over 6 years." "Because you got close," she said, voice tight, "and someone still needs that box to stay buried." Another round hit the dirt beside them, throwing up a plume of dust. Shadow barked once, sharp and short. Elira pointed toward a ravine just downhill. "That's our exit. Go when I say." David didn't argue. He moved, Shadow at his side like a shadow himself. They sprinted downhill, Elira covering them with suppressing fire, until they reached a narrow gully overgrown with weeds and fractured stone. The gunfire ceased, but the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. They regrouped behind a rock formation. David's hands were raw from digging, blood soaked through his shirt where a graze had opened an old scar. Shadow pressed close, his breathing steady but eyes watchful. They tried to kill us, David muttered. You're not leaving, Elira said. They tried to erase you. David leaned his head back against the rock. Why bring us here if it was a trap? It wasn't a trap, Elira said. It was a test. Someone on the inside helped us get this far. But someone else, someone higher is still pulling strings. David's hand drifted to the earth-packed bag slung across his back. Inside it, he could feel the cold corners of metal, half dug before the shots rang out. He'd managed to yank it free just before the third bullet hit. The box was real, and it was with them now. Shadow hadn't moved. He stared back up the ridge, ears rigid. His body vibrated like a drawn bowstring. He hadn't let go of the moment. Neither had David. Because somewhere up that slope, a sniper with a suppressed rifle had aimed to end a truth before it surfaced. And something about the precision of that shot felt far too familiar. The three of them huddled beneath the jagged overhang of shale and limestone, breaths shallow as dawn crept over the ridge like a secret. The gunfire had stopped hours ago, but none of them dared call it safe. David's fingers never left the rusted metal box now sitting between his knees, dirt still clinging to the hinges like a warning. Elira crouched opposite, eyes flicking from the slope above to the shadows behind them. Shadow paced in a tight semicircle, alert, ears pricked at every rustle of wind through the pine needles. Open it, Elira whispered. Whatever's in there, someone just tried to kill us to keep it buried. David hesitated for half a second, then unlatched the box. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, a small black audio recorder sat nestled beside a stack of yellowed documents, sealed in a vacuum bag. Beneath them, a strip of old dog tags and a blood-stained field report, partially torn. But it was the recorder David reached for first. His hands shook as he thumbed the play button. A click, then static, then voices. Unit Emberfall command log. Operation Shadowlight. Directive override confirmed. Target, Lieutenant Thomas Rourke. Terminate with precision. Frame Halden. Use field asset 6. Elira sucked in a sharp breath. Rourke was the guy you were convicted of killing. David didn't speak. His mouth had gone dry. The voice continued. Same voice. Make it look like a fallout between brothers. The rookie's got motive. Post-deployment PTSD. Resource theft. Make it believable. I'll handle Dorsey. David's stomach clenched. The voice wasn't random. It wasn't some shadowy general from a file no one had access to. It was clean, confident, with just the hint of a southern drawl buried beneath decades of command training. It belonged to Colonel Matthew Stone. He had known that voice since he was 23 years old. The man had pulled him out of a collapsed bunker in Kandahar, given him a field commission, and called him son the first time David earned a commendation. He had stood by David's hospital bed when no one else came. He had pinned Shadow's badge to his vest, and he had framed him for murder. David staggered back, breath catching in his throat. No, he whispered. It can't be. He saved my life. Elira's jaw tightened. Or he kept you alive long enough to use you when he needed a scapegoat. The tape continued, now distorted by years of decay and static, but the core message was unmistakable. The colonel had orchestrated the entire operation, including the cover-up and the silencing of witnesses. He had even coordinated with civilian law enforcement to bury the evidence trail before it could resurface. Elira pulled the sealed documents from the bag and flipped through them quickly. Encrypted dispatch logs, unauthorized wire transfers, redacted mission orders. She paused at one marked with a red triangle, identical to the one Shadow had scratched into David's chest. This is Emberfall's kill directive. Operation was illegal from the beginning. David's vision blurred. Everything he'd believed, every loyalty, every ounce of pain he'd buried, was being rewound, unraveled, exposed. He said he'd look after my unit, David muttered. He said, if anything happened, he'd protect Shadow. Shadow let out a low growl and pressed his body against David's side, grounding him. Elira glanced up at the slope. We need to move, now. If that sniper was one of Stone's, reinforcements are coming. She shoved the documents back in the box, snapped it shut, and strapped it to her pack. David sat frozen. "I trusted him," he whispered. Elira grabbed his arm. "You trusted a man who saw you as an expendable piece of a puzzle. But right now, the world thinks you're guilty. That tape is the only voice that can shout back louder. We don't have time to mourn the lie." David met her eyes. "We're not going back to Grafton, are we?" She shook her head. "If we do, the evidence disappears before it reaches the light." Shadow gave a single bark. Elira reached into her radio. "I've got a contact in D.C., someone at the Office of Inspector General who's been tracking Stone since 2016. I couldn't prove anything until now." David stood slowly, hands clenched, blood roaring in his ears. "Then we take it to them." A sound broke the silence. A snapping twig, too heavy for wildlife. Elira raised her weapon instantly. "They're flanking. We've got maybe 5 minutes." David grabbed Shadow's collar. "We take the low ridge. There's a dry wash that runs west. It'll give us cover." They moved fast, the box secured between them, Shadow darting ahead to scout the path. Every step felt like walking deeper into a graveyard of truths, long thought buried. David didn't speak again. Not even when he tripped on a route that hadn't been there years ago. Not when the old scar beneath his ribs flared like it was freshly cut. The pain kept him alert, focused. Stone had taken everything from him. His freedom, his honor, nearly his life. But he hadn't taken Shadow. And he hadn't taken the truth. The plane touched down just before dawn, its wheels screeching against the tarmac of a private airfield outside Arlington. Elira kept her head low beneath her cap, scanning the hangar for anyone who didn't belong. Shadow stayed curled at David's feet beneath the cargo bench, silent but watching. The steel box containing the audio recording and documents was strapped beneath Elira's seat, handcuffed to her wrist. It wasn't just evidence now. It was a bomb. One that, if detonated right, could rip through an entire system. But first, they needed it heard. By noon, they stood before a federal judge in a secured hearing room, Elira presenting credentials, David speaking with measured urgency, and the box placed on the table between them like an artifact recovered from a war everyone pretended never happened. The judge, a silver-haired man with deep lines on his face and a voice like a hammer wrapped in velvet, listened in silence as Elira played the recording. He didn't flinch when Stone's voice came through the speakers. He didn't blink at the phrase "Frame Halden." He just leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "This is inadmissible." David's jaw clenched. "Excuse me?" "It was obtained unlawfully," the judge replied. "No chain of custody, no search warrant. And according to military code, this box is classified material. Possession alone could lead to charges against both of you." Elira's voice was steel. "That tape proves conspiracy to commit murder by a sitting colonel. And unless you have corroborating testimony or an official declassification order, it also proves nothing to a court," the judge said calmly. "My hands are tied." David stood. "So you're telling me that I'm still a murderer in the eyes of the law?" "I'm telling you," the judge replied, "that justice and the system it rides in on are not always the same thing." An hour later, they were escorted out under federal watch. The box returned to Elira's custody, but now technically in limbo. No charges were dropped, no new trial granted, and for David Halden, the clock remained ticking toward execution. Back in a secure hotel room, David sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet while Shadow rested beside him. "They're going to bury it again," he said, "just like they buried the truth the first time." Elira didn't respond. She was staring at her laptop, where a contact from her days in military intelligence had just sent her a trove of internal files, leaked anonymously. Most of it was redacted, until she opened one video file titled, Trial_Halden_full of... "David," she said slowly, "you need to see this." He turned to the screen as the courtroom from 7 years ago filled the frame. It was a silent recording, pulled from an angle no network ever aired, showing the prosecutor walking toward the bench during recess, sliding a folder across to the presiding judge, whispering something that made the man's face go pale before nodding once. Moments later, that same folder disappeared into the judge's briefcase and never resurfaced in court records. Proof of a hidden communication, Elira said. That folder might have contained an order to suppress your defense. David leaned in. This never made it into my appeals. You see, your family became the major barrier between you and anyone else in the room. Before either of them could speak again, her laptop pinged, notifications flooding in from social media. The file had been leaked. Somehow, someone had uploaded the full, unedited video of David's trial to every major platform. TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit. The video was already viral. It took less than 12 hours for the world to catch fire. By morning, journalists were camped outside Grafton. Protesters gathered at the front gates, waving signs that read "Free Halden" and "Dogs don't lie, but systems do." Veterans groups issued statements demanding a retrial. Civil rights lawyers called for the Department of Justice to investigate judicial misconduct. A documentary filmmaker who had once profiled military dogs posted an exposé linking Shadow's history with the Emberfall mission. David watched it unfold from a window 5 floors up, surrounded by a world that no longer seemed content to sit quietly. Shadow sat beside him, tail flicking once as a news chopper flew overhead. Inside the prison, Warden Dorsey stood alone in his office, watching the crowd build through the security feed. For the first time in 20 years, his walls no longer felt secure. "You've seen riots over food," he muttered, "but never over one man's story." A junior guard entered. "Sir, the governor's on line 3, and CNN just requested a live statement." Dorsey didn't answer. He turned to a folder on his desk. Now he wasn't so sure. In Washington, the pressure reached the Senate floor. A committee convened, the Office of the Inspector General launched an inquiry, and Colonel Matthew Stone, who had not made a public appearance in over a year, was photographed leaving a private defense contractor's building outside Langley, looking unshaken. When asked about the allegations, he simply replied, "I have no comment on matters of national security." But the public wasn't buying silence anymore. And in a room filled with cables, hard drives, and file stacks, Elira connected the final upload. This time, not just a video, but the full contents of the steel box. Every document, every transmission log, every unredacted name. She hit send. The internet did the rest. 3 days after the video leak, after the protests had swelled from dozens to hundreds and the governor had called for an emergency review, David Halden sat in a holding room at the federal courthouse with a chain around one ankle and Shadow curled at his feet like a sentry waiting for a war to start. The air was thick with nerves. Not his own Elira paced in front of the two-way mirror, phone pressed to her ear, her voice hushed but urgent. "You're sure you saw his face? Where? When?" A pause. Then her eyes widened. "You're damn right we're still interested. Get him here. Now." She ended the call and turned to David, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to believe who's still alive." David straightened slightly. "Who?" "Elijah Moreno," she said. "Your old spotter." David's mouth opened, then closed again, the name punching through him like a ghost had stepped into the room. "No. He died in the ambush. I saw the report. I saw his boots." "You saw what they wanted you to see," Elira interrupted. "But he wasn't in that body bag. He lost his leg. They airlifted him out on a classified medical evac. Then they scrubbed his name." "Because he heard something," she said, "and now he's ready to tell it." An hour later, the door opened, and Elijah Moreno entered slowly. One crutch under his right arm, the other sleeve of his fatigues pinned up where his leg used to be. His face was thinner than David remembered, eyes darker. But the voice, deep, calm, razor-edged with suppressed anger, was exactly the same. David stood but said nothing. Moreno gave a small nod. "Still breathing, huh?" David managed a faint smile. "I thought you were dead." "Yeah, well," Moreno said, limping to a chair. "So did I. But they kept me under lockdown for almost 2 years. Military psych ward in Nevada. No visitors, no phones, just meds and memory tests. Jesus, David muttered. Why? Because I heard the wrong thing, Moreno said, leaning forward. Night before Rourke died, I couldn't sleep. Went out to smoke behind the supply hut. That's when I saw Stone talking to the comms officer. He thought they were alone. He said it plain as day. David's throat dried out. You're sure he said my name? He didn't whisper, Moreno said. He gave it like a goddamn order. Shadow sat up straighter at the sound of Moreno's voice, ears turning. David looked at Alira. That's direct evidence. That's a witness. It's more than that, she said. It's the missing puzzle piece. We have motive, we have cover-up, and now we have a living, breathing man who heard the plan before it happened. Moreno leaned back, pain etched across his face. I tried to tell someone, but they had me sedated by noon the next day. The moment Stone realized I was still breathing, I became a liability. Alira nodded. He was taken off the record, hidden like a defect. David sat back down, his mind churning through timelines, memories, betrayals. Why now? Why come forward? Moreno's eyes locked with his. Because someone finally shouted loud enough for me to hear. And because I owe you. You pulled me out of that crater in Helmond. Now I get to pull you out of this one. The next morning, a new emergency hearing was convened. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks, protesters, and armed security. Inside, the federal review panel, now with 3 justices, not one, sat behind a marble dais. Eyes sharp, pens poised. Alira presented the case. The video leak. The suppressed courtroom footage. The voice of Colonel Matthew Stone. The classified documents from the steel box. And then, Elijah Moreno took the stand. He recounted the night before the murder, the overheard conversation, the look on Stone's face when he realized he'd been spotted, the sudden transfer, the years in isolation. When asked if he believed David Halden committed the crime, Moreno looked the lead judge in the eye and said, "Not in 1,000 lifetimes." David didn't flinch. He sat in silence, shadow beside him, the courtroom hushed. When the hearing ended, the justices left without a word. The gavel never fell. But the news broke before they reached their chambers. An anonymous source inside the federal clerk's office had leaked the preliminary ruling. One of the justices had already signed a recommendation for a full exoneration review. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was oxygen. That night, as Alira, David, and Shadow sat in a guarded room beneath the courthouse, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't a ghost from the past. It was a federal marshal. And he wasn't alone. 2 days after Elijah Moreno's testimony shook the courtroom, the media landscape exploded. Every network, every digital feed, every late-night political show had picked up the case. Headlines screamed wrongfully convicted vet and Haldavy system, while comment sections flooded with outrage, patriotism, conspiracy theories, and dog emojis in honor of Shadow. But amid the noise, one particular announcement turned everything sideways. It came during a live interview on a primetime political show known more for sensationalism than substance. The host leaned forward, gleaming teeth catching the studio lights. Tonight, in an exclusive, we welcome a decorated military leader, a man who served this country with honor and who now finds himself in the crosshairs of a stunning accusation. Please welcome Colonel Matthew Stone, retired. The screen split, and there he was, older but unmistakable, crisp suit, shaved jawline, eyes that could still freeze a cadet at 20 paces. Stone nodded solemnly, voice grave. Let me be clear, I have never in my career ordered or authorized the framing of a fellow soldier. These claims are outrageous, unsubstantiated, and deeply hurtful to the families of those who gave their lives honorably, including Lieutenant Rourke. David watched the segment from a holding room, jaw tight. Alira paced behind him, arms crossed, fury simmering beneath her calm. The host continued, "Colonel, they say there's a recording. Your voice issuing a kill directive. Stone barely blinked. Audio can be manipulated. Technology today is frightening. I stand by my record, and I will pursue legal action against any outlet that promotes this slander. He smiled thinly. The truth always finds the light, eventually. It did, but not in the way Stone expected. The next morning, during a special closed-door hearing, David was allowed to testify one final time. The courtroom was quiet. Cameras had been barred, but microphones were hot. In his testimony, David said little. Instead, he asked for permission to play an unreleased segment of the recovered audio. The judge allowed it. The tape crackled to life. Stone's voice, "Use Protocol Viper Echo. That'll keep the handler in line." Gasps rippled through the rows. David turned to the court. That phrase, Viper Echo, was never used outside Task Unit Emberfall. It was a psychological control code designed to suppress canine response during combat trauma. Only 7 people knew it. 4 are dead. 2 testified. The last just went on national television pretending it means nothing. One of the justices leaned forward. "You're absolutely sure?" David gestured to Shadow, who sat motionless beside him. "Ask the dog." A handler was brought forward. They played the phrase again. Shadow flinched, then laid flat on the ground, whining, body stiff. David said nothing. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, halfway across town, another blow landed. The state's forensic lab released a sealed report, one that had been buried under classified status during the original trial. This time, it was public. The report stated that the bullet recovered from Lieutenant Rourke's chest had been misidentified. It wasn't a standard-issue sidearm round, like the prosecution claimed in David's trial. It was a .458 SOCOM, an armor-piercing, custom-fabricated military round used only in high-value covert operations, and only issued to officers ranked 05 and above. The room turned tense. Elira slammed the folder down on the table. "You know who carried that caliber in the unit? Stone, no one else. The rifles were locked in a secure armory that required dual athletication clearance. That bullet is his fingerprint." The medical examiner took the stand via video link. A man in his 60s, tired eyes but a sharp voice. "I was told not to report it back then. I was told it would confuse the narrative, but I've kept the fragment. I compared it to the inventory records pulled from Base 47's manifest this week. Matches perfect. That bullet never belonged to Halden." In the gallery, no one moved. Even the judge sat frozen, as if the system itself had stopped breathing. Later that day, Colonel Stone released a second statement, this time via prepared video. "The smear campaign against my name is a coordinated attack by individuals with political and financial interests. I will not dignify it with further comment." But the damage was done. Veteran organizations issued joint statements condemning Stone. 2 senators called for a congressional investigation. 1 military tribunal reopened records previously classified as lost in transit. Shadow was filmed outside the courthouse, licking David's hand, surrounded by cheering supporters. Yet amid the growing momentum, David remained quiet. That night, back in the holding area, he sat alone with the steel box in front of him, now reopened, its contents reduced to the truth that refused to stay buried. Shadow curled at his side, head resting on David's boot. Elira entered without knocking. "You're preparing a full reversal motion," she said. "Exoneration, honorable discharge reinstated, possible reparations." David didn't look up. "And Stone?" "You're cornering him. He's going to lash out." David ran a hand over the worn edge of the dog tag in his palm. "Then we make sure we're ready." He rose slowly. A man built not just by battle but by betrayal. Shadow stood with him. Outside, thunder rolled. The execution chamber was silent except for the ticking of a small wall-mouth clock, its second hand crawling toward the hour that no one in that room wanted to meet. David Halden lay strapped to the gurney beneath harsh fluorescent lights, his face calm, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though listening for a sound that only he and his dog would recognize. The IV was prepped. The physician stood by, head bowed. Warden Dorsey looked straight ahead, jaw locked. Shadow was not in the room. He had not been permitted inside. But David knew he was close. He could feel him, just on the other side of the thick concrete wall, pacing. Outside the prison gates, the crowd surged. Hundreds of voices chanted David's name, waving flags, holding signs with photos of Shadow, hashtags written in bold ink. Justice for Halden, Shadow knows. Elira was there, one hand holding her phone, the other raised to shield her eyes as a black Suseo finally appeared through the press of bodies. The vehicle pushed forward, sirens off, lights flashing. Inside was a sealed envelope bearing the seat for it had taken too long. Traffic, confusion, resistance from within. But it was here now. Back in the chamber. The warden gave the nod. The technician stepped forward. The clock hit 0. Just as the man reached for the injection lever, the chamber door burst open. A voice shouted, "Stop! Executive clemency order!" A federal marshal rushed inside, papers in hand, breath ragged. The room froze. David didn't move. Not yet. The warden took the envelope, broke the seal, read the order aloud. The IV was disconnected, the straps removed. David slowly sat up, blinking beneath the white light, chest rising and falling like the slow breath of a man waking from a nightmare. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the marshal turned to David and said, "You're a free man, Sergeant." Outside, the crowd erupted as the news broke. Elira held her phone to the sky, streaming it live, her voice cracking with emotion. Shadow barked once, sharp and clear, like he knew before anyone else what the sound meant. That night, David didn't go home, because home didn't exist anymore. He went instead to Elira's safe house, a small cabin far from the city. He walked through the door without chains. Shadow walked beside him, off-leash for the first time in years. No fences, no bars. David sat on the wooden floor, back against the wall, eyes staring into the dark, not speaking. Shadow curled beside him and rested his chin across David's foot. The only light came from the fireplace Elira had lit before she left them alone. The flames flickered against the walls, like ghosts finally retreating. Around midnight, Shadow rose. David watched as the dog padded quietly to the back door, nudged it open and stepped out into the night. Moonlight cast silver light across the field behind the cabin. Shadow walked straight to the old tree at the edge of the property and began to dig. 5 minutes later, Shadow emerged with something gripped gently in his teeth. He trotted back and dropped it at David's feet. David knelt. In his hands he found a military insignia, burned, frayed but unmistakable, the emblem of Task Unit Emberfall, a badge that was thought to have been lost during the ambush in Kandahar. On the back, etched faintly into the scorched metal, were initials, dozens of them. His team, men thought dead, some still missing, all carried with him in silence. And in the center, the largest carving of all. David Halden. The man they had never forgotten. The man who had carried them out one by one as mortars fell. Shadow had hidden it. Held it. Protected it. Because he remembered the day the world forgot who David was. Now the world remembered. David sat down beside his dog in the grass, the metal warm from Shadow's breath in his palm. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just leaned forward and rested his forehead gently against Shadow's. Both of them still, quiet, and finally, if this story moved you, if Shadow's loyalty and David's fight for justice stirred something deep inside you, don't forget to like this story and subscribe to follow more powerful, emotional journeys like this one. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it when the clemency arrived at the last second? When Shadow dug up the lost insignia? Or maybe when the Colonel's voice finally cracked open the truth? And here's a question for you. Do you think Shadow knew all along? That he had always been holding on to the last piece of David's honor? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, Say a prayer for all the soldiers